and welcome to the Adjusted for Risk podcast here from the shores of Lake Tahoe. Today's episode is sponsored by the award-winning Zephyr, which helps advisors, wealth managers, financial analysts, and investment professionals make more informed investment decisions. Since Zephyr's inception some 30 years ago, Zephyr has been recognized as an industry leader in investment analytics. That status hasn't been built overnight, but rather it's been built on years of thought-provoking content and research and unparalleled presentation of those analytics that help investment professionals tell their story. In addition to the traditional investment analytics, Zephyr's also created a new analytics that help these same investment professionals tell their entire story, not just part of it. So through a series of Zephyr StatFact videos, I will help you make sense of some of these investment analytics that are used, or in some cases, maybe not used enough today, and how you should use them. Some of you may be familiar with the Zephyr StatFacts, which was the creation or the brainchild of former Zephyr colleague, Mark Otto. So I'm going to go ahead and take these fantastic resources and put them in a video format. There are a lot of great investment metrics, and in some case, it's like alphabet soup, which can make it confusing in determining what metric an investment professional should use. So hopefully this series of StatFact podcasts will make it easier for you. So in this edition, I'm going to go ahead and focus on the risk statistic known as tracking error. There are a lot of ways to measure investment risk, whether you're measuring volatility risk by using standard deviation, or you're trying to measure quantified downside risk by using the Zephyr Pain Index. Tracking error is a benchmark relative risk measure that measures the volatility of excess returns. Tracking error is also known as standard deviation of excess returns. Tracking error measures how consistently a manager outperforms or underperforms its benchmark. So how is it useful? Tracking error, as I said, measures the consistency of excess returns. It is created by taking the difference between the manager return and the benchmark return every month or quarter, and then calculating how volatile the difference is in terms of volatility or the standard deviation. So it's looking at the standard deviation of those excess returns. Tracking error is also very useful in determining just how active a manager's strategy is. The lower the tracking error, the closer the manager follows the benchmark. The higher the tracking error, the more the manager deviates from the benchmark. So what is a good number? A good tracking error really depends on investor preference. If the investor believes markets are efficient and that is difficult for active managers to consistently add value, then the investor would prefer a lower tracking error. Alternatively, if the investor believes smart active managers can add significant value and should not be tied down to a benchmark, the investor would tolerate higher levels of tracking error. But what are the limitations? And the limitations are similar to the limitations of standard deviation, and that makes sense since we're tracking the standard deviation or volatility of excess returns. So tracking error really cuts both ways, measuring both periods of outperformance and underperformance versus the benchmark. An investor would prefer a high tracking error if there's a high degree of outperformance, but a low tracking error if there was consistent underperformance. Tracking error does not distinguish between the two, whether you have underperformance or outperformance. Just like standard deviation. Standard deviation doesn't distinguish between good volatility or bad volatility, or positive returns and negative returns. And that's what we see with tracking error. It doesn't distinguish between outperformance or underperformance. When there's a lot of outperformance, you'd like to see higher tracking error. What are typical values? There really isn't a typical value for tracking error. Instead, there really is a wide spectrum of products available in every asset class, ranging from purely passive to very active within that spectrum of managers within a specific asset class. So theoretically, an index fund should have a tracking error of 0 relative to its benchmark. Enhanced index funds typically have tracking errors, say, in the 1% to 2% range. Most traditional active managers have tracking errors anywhere from 4% to, say, 7%. Those active managers who are willing to take bigger bets away from the index might exhibit tracking errors in that 10% to 15% range. So absolute return or benchmark agnostic strategies could even have higher tracking errors. So when you look at what a typical tracking error should be, don't look at it in terms of maybe like asset class, large growth versus small growth or small value. Look at it in terms of what type of manager is it? Is it an active manager or a passive manager? Or is it a very active manager or a manager, like I said, that's benchmark agnostic? That's what you have to look at, because within a large growth category, there's passive managers and active managers. Think of it that way versus in terms of asset class. Tracking error is one of my go-to risk metrics. Locating managers who consistently add value are highly sought after and bring a lot of value to an investment portfolio, especially during times of volatility and uncertainty like we've experienced over the past year and a half or so. Lastly, if you prefer actively managed mutual funds, you want to make sure that manager is indeed active and not a closet index fund, since you're paying higher management fees. If you're paying those higher management fees, you expect your manager to be active. So thank you so much for watching and listening to this week's episode of Adjusted for Risk. Remember, you can watch previous Zephyr StatFact episodes of the Adjusted for Risk podcast on our Adjusted for Risk YouTube channel, as well as Spotify and iHeartRadio. You can also get more of our insights at A Wealth of Insight from 6,237 feet.com blog. Thank you once again, and have a fantastic rest of your week.